sort of gives us a new understanding of her and of the 1950s. So Sheila was born in Salford just before the Second World War, and the war really shaped her life and her writing thereafter. It was a time of great disruption. Her dad served abroad. He returned only in 1945, and he was seriously invalided. He suffered with his injuries for the rest of his life. So her mother became the family's breadwinner and brought Sheila and her younger brother up single-handed during the early 1940s. They moved around quite a lot. And eventually at the end of the war, they were allocated a council house. And in this slide, you can see Sheila in her trademark white raincoat stood outside that council house in Duchy Road in Salford, one of the new post-war council housing developments. Sheila, which you can't really see from this photo, was very tall. She was 6 foot at a time when women were slightly shorter on average than they are today. And she was very self-conscious about it. And she always felt that she kind of didn't really quite fit in, partly because of that, and partly because of all of the moving around, and partly because she never really felt that the message that she was being given by the media and by politicians and by her schools really fitted what was actually happening with her life. So we know that after the Second World War, the Labour government achieved a great deal in terms of the welfare state, and Sheila was a lifelong supporter of Labour and a lifelong supporter of the welfare state. She was a very early beneficiary of the National Health Service. She was very ill just after the war, and the NHS provided her with convalescent care in the late 1940s, just the year after the NHS had been established. But at the same time, she was also, as I think many people were and are, critical of the top-down nature of welfare provision. When she was sent away to convalesce from her illness, she was sent to a nursing home run by nuns on the Lancashire coast. You know, this was the kind of transition years of the late 1940s. So many of those formerly private institutions were being used to provide NHS services. And she found that, she was there for several months, and she found that a really difficult period. You know, her dad had just come home, the family had just settled into this new house, and then she was sent away from her family for ages and never really knew what was going on. Nobody ever really told her what was going on. When she returned, she sat the 11 plus for grammar school, and she failed. Such an indictment of that system that 80% of kids didn't pass and were told they were failures. And that was a great shock to her dad, a great disappointment to her dad, really. And she, although she said that she wasn't really very bothered by it, she was very close to her dad, and letting him down was something that was very difficult for her. She also always had this kind of radical side, which came from family stories. She liked to tell journalists that her granddad had met Keir Hardie, and we don't know whether that was true or not, because she was the right one for telling tall tales. But nevertheless, her dad told her a lot of stories about being away in the war, and about his childhood in Manchester with said granddad. And that really made an impression on her. So she always sort of said that she felt like she was instinctively a socialist, but in some ways a more libertarian socialist than the kind of 1945 Labour government might have appreciated. And her kind of mixed up feelings about the welfare state, the benevolence of it on the one hand, and yet the sense of top-downness on the other, were encapsulated in a story that she wrote in the early 1960s called Sweetly Sings the Donkey, which is in this collection. I just wanted to read a tiny bit from it. So in this story, it's semi-autobiographical. It's about a young woman who is sent away to a convalescent home on the Lancashire coast just after the Second World War. And while she's there, a government investigator comes to ask her about her life. And this is the exchange between the girl and the government investigator. So it's the investigator who speaks first. The answers that you give to my questions are private. When the report we are compiling is published, no names will be mentioned. You will be nothing more or less than a statistic. Question 1, what sort of school do you attend? An ordinary state school. Good. What's good about it? Asks the girl. Well, not so many years ago, a girl of your class would not have received any education at all. From the cradle, you would have probably been sent to the mill or factory. You'd never have known the glories and benefits of a good education. But the present society we live in has raised the standard of living of all classes to heights hitherto unheard of, undreamt of 100 years ago. You are a fortunate child indeed to have been born into a compassionate and enlightened age. Now, have you taken the entrance exam for grammar school? Yes. Pass or fail? Fail. Never mind, nothing to be ashamed of. At a secondary school, you will be receiving an education ideally suited to your capabilities. And so it goes on. So she has quite a lot of fun with that. And her experience of the welfare state was of never quite fitting in. You know, touched on, you know, the kind of unease that she felt about being sent away from home to this convalescent home where she was constantly being told how lucky she was to be getting free treatment. After she took the 11 plus, she went to the local secondary modern school, but because her result in the 11 plus had been good and because she did well at the secondary modern, she was then transferred to a girls' grammar school in Salford in her mid-teens, which was quite an unusual thing to happen. So she had this vantage point that she developed on life and on society and her community that was slightly detached right at a young age, partly because she'd been away from her family for all those months, convalescing, and then partly because, unusually, she'd actually had personal experience of both sides of the 11 plus coin. And what she always said was that she preferred the secondary modern. And she said that to the press later, but actually I was lucky enough to be able to speak to one of her teachers at the secondary modern school who's still alive and living in Salford. And she said that she wasn't surprised because she said Sheila was very unconventional, she was very arty. And the secondary modern that she was at had a number of feminist teachers who were really keen. It was a mixed girls and boys school, but they were really keen on promoting girls and encouraging them to do things like act in plays and so on. Whereas the grammar school that she went on to was deeply conventional, and Sheila left at the age of 17, having been told that if she worked very hard, she might be able to become a teacher. And she just was so alienated by this idea that, you know, as a woman, you know, you were being trained really to be a middle-class woman who would either become a housewife or go into teaching. Yeah, very typical 1950s kind of choice. Whereas at the secondary modern, she'd been introduced to Othello, and she later got into a bit of amateur dramatics in Salford and developed that interest after she left school. She spent her late teens in a series of jobs in factories and shops around Salford, doing, so far as we can tell, as little work as possible. But the letter to Joan Littlewood, which suggested that she'd never really had anything to do with the theatre, was a fib. She was very involved in the very vibrant theatre scene that developed in Manchester and Salford after the Second World War, partly due to some socialists there who were very keen on avant-garde theatre, and partly due to state investment in the arts, which meant that there were youth theatre groups and local theatre companies that she could go and watch and get involved with. And it was a guy called David Skase, who had worked previously with Theatre Workshop, who advised Sheila on how to go about writing a play and ultimately advised her to send it to Joan Littlewood. She was also very interested in Samuel Beckett and in surrealism generally. And I think what this points us towards is that she was really interested in the kinds of the feelings and the passions and the imagination, the kinds of things that her grammar school was never really interested in. And that 50s politics wasn't really very interested in. You know, it was a real time of sort of realpolitik. You know, people have to get real. There's no point having ideals. You know, it's, you know, if you didn't go along with the status quo, you know, what do you want to be, a communist? You know, do you want to go and live in Stalinist Russia? And she really kicked against that and saw in Beckett and some other writers a way of thinking about life differently. Why did she want to think about life differently? Well, largely because she was a working class woman. And something that made a big impression on Sheila as a young woman, here she is as a late teenager in her home in Salford, was the life of her mother. Whoops, sorry, let's go back one. This is Sheila, just after A Taste of Honey came out, with her mum on the left, Elsie. And she spoke very warmly in later life about how she, as in common with many young women, had watched her mum work really hard after the Second World War, both looking after her dad, trying to make a home on this new council estate that was not much more than a building site when they first moved there, and also working for a living at a time when Sheila's dad wasn't always able to work very much. So she was very struck by how hard a mum and a mum's generation had to work, and she didn't want that for herself. And of course, one of the great things about the welfare state was that it told a generation of kids, you shouldn't have to work that hard. You know, you deserve an education just for being you. And for all that she kicked against certain aspects of the top-downness of those messages, nevertheless, she imbibed them, and they had quite a radical impact on Sheila, and I would argue on many of that generation, which is why we then see them as the kind of the striking militants of the 1960s, the feminists of the 1970s. Already in the late 50s, Sheila was thinking about and acting on ideas which we more commonly associate with the women's liberation movement of the 1970s. She told her friends that she didn't want to get married, but neither did she want to be a teacher. She wanted to write, she wanted independence, she wanted to travel. She wanted also, she said, to be able to have a baby without getting married. So she wanted what the kinds of life that an affluent man might take for granted, but she also wanted to be able to become a mother. She wanted a very different kind of world for women. And that was something which came out in all of her writing, but right from the start there in A Taste of Honey, where one of the most radical things about that play is that it centres working class women and their voices and their discontent, because neither Helen, the mother of Jo, nor Jo herself think that motherhood is enough. They're incredibly loving towards each other, but they're also incredibly resentful of the idea that this is all that a woman's life should be, and that being a mother should be everything to them. So that was, and frankly remains, a really radical thing to do, to put working class women on the stage. She was able to do it, as I've said, by being helped by people like David Skase, by working out her own experiences and putting into prose some of her own aspirations that had grown up during the 1950s. And predominantly, of course, because Joan Littlewood and Theatre Workshop existed. And I think that tells us something about the way in which radical and socialist ventures really can give young people something that isn't otherwise there. When I was doing the research, I was often asked, where's the next Shelagh Delaney? Well, I work quite closely with theatre groups in Salford and Manchester, and there are tons of Shelagh Delaneys just in our area. But there's no Joan Littlewood, unfortunately, and that's a real shame and a real loss. The play, as I've said, did very, very well. It was absolutely panned by critics, but the local theatre goers, and Theatre Workshop was in East London, so it was a very mixed, socially mixed audience. The local theatre goers loved it, and it transferred to the West End in 1959, and then to Broadway, and then Tony Richardson made it into a film. And it also did really well internationally. I was lucky enough to speak to women from across the world who'd been really influenced by it in the 1960s, women in the Eastern Bloc, who told me about seeing it as university students. And although the film was subject to some degree of censorship, particularly around Jeff's homosexuality, what they took from it was this idea that, women can do anything, and that feminism, far from being antithetical to socialism, which was often how it was presented in some of those Eastern Bloc administrations, was actually, absolutely about equality and about liberation. Similarly, I spoke to a woman quite by chance who'd grown up in Israel on a kibbutz, very working class family, and she'd been desperate to travel the world after seeing the film of A Taste of Honey. She said she just thought that Salford just looked like the most glamorous place. So she set out on a round the world tour. She got as far as Los Angeles and met her husband, and she's still there. So she'd never made it to Salford, but she said just this kind of sense that it was okay for women to say, I'd like some more, please. I don't just want this life, was something that was radical enough to make her think, I want to travel the world, I'm going to emigrate. So it had a phenomenal impact on people. And it had a great impact on Sheila's life as well. That's a still from the film. Because it made her fortune, it made her famous, and she loved that. She absolutely loved it. So she moved quite quickly to London. She travelled regularly to the USA. She led this kind of celebrity lifestyle. She was very independent, and she wanted her taste of independence. Joan Littlewood and Joan's partner, Jerry Raffles, were Sheila's guardians because she was under 21 at a time when 21 was the age of majority. And she, in the end, took them to court to get hold of some of the money because she said she wanted to buy a sports car. She'd grown up in a family with very little, and she'd grown up in austerity and rationing, and now she wanted to have a really good time. And she won the court case, and she got the money, and she bought the sports car, and she drove it once, and then realised that she had very poor eyesight. She realised she hated driving, so she gave it to her younger brother. But she had fun at a time when having fun was something radical, really, because the post-war society was all about working hard to win the peace, and the idea that you don't get anything if you don't work hard. The Tories were very into that kind of line in the 1950s. The idea of a meritocracy was something that was very strong. But I think that people who've grown up knowing that their parents were poor and insecure, as Sheila's were in the 1930s, what they took from the kind of messages that they got from their parents and from the welfare state was, we deserve more, not just the ability to make ends meet, but actually adventure, travel, those kinds of things. And that's what I heard again and again as I interviewed women who were Sheila's friends, or just Sheila's age, or readers or viewers of the play. And that was something that was really inspiring. She played around a lot with her identity. You saw on the previous slide, short hair and smoking. And then by the early 60s, she was back to long hair and presenting herself in a much more literary style. She was doing what any teenager relishes doing, which is playing around with different ways of being. And that was something that was fantastic for her. But it was also tough. She had a huge amount of negative press publicity. It was said very widely in the media that she hadn't written A Taste of Honey, that Joan Littlewood had written it. I know that that's a lie because I've seen the original draft, which is held in the British Library. The local press in Salford really turned against her and said it was filth, and that she must be a prostitute in order to know about illegitimacy. The Daily Mail really went for her and said, if this is the best that the welfare state produces, then it should be abolished. And she was very, very badly affected by that, to the extent that, the press coverage reached a crescendo in 1963 when Sheila had her daughter Charlotte as a single mother. Charlotte's father was a married American who Sheila had met when she was overseas touring with A Taste of Honey. She kept his identity secret, apart from Charlotte and a few friends, until the end of her life. And after Charlotte's birth, Sheila didn't do a newspaper interview for another 15 years because she was so traumatized, really, by the bad press. And when you read the press now, what you see is the idea that a working class woman has got above herself and needs to be absolutely slammed down. It's very, very different from the more positive coverage that the young working class men who were making their names in the arts at that time, like Albert Finney, were receiving. She went on to write a second play, A Lion in Love, which didn't do as well, but did pretty well, actually. And Ken Tynan, the very well-respected critic of The Observer, he liked it a lot. He said it just needed better production, but he thought that the writing was excellent. And I asked people in the theatre business, why they thought that the second play hadn't really worked out for her. And a lot of them said, because if you're working class, particularly if you're a woman, then and now you get one shot. And that's it. And what you don't get is the mentoring, the support networks, the Oxbridge old school ties stuff that takes you through a career. Every time you produce something, you have to hope that it's going to be a bestseller or a massive success because nobody is going to support you. And that was the case with Sheila, really. The second play was decent. It wasn't as good as A Taste of Honey, but it was good. And if she'd been a different person from a different background, it might have really gone places. She became very involved in politics in the early 1960s. Here she is with Doris Lessing and others at a Ban the Bomb protest in the early 60s. She was an advocate of comprehensive education, and she refused to have her plays staged in South Africa as an opponent of apartheid. And then she also tried to start a community theatre in Salford with huge amounts of support from Salford Trades Council. This was in the early 1960s when Arnold Wesker's idea of Centre 42 was really taking off. But that was kiboshed because Salford Council, Labour, but Conservative Labour, did a compulsory purchase order on the building and knocked it down because they couldn't stand Sheila, and they really couldn't stand the idea of community theatre that was led by her. She got her own back in the mid-1960s when she teamed up with Lindsay Anderson to make a film called The White Bus, which is a story of a young woman who comes from Salford and goes back there and takes a bus tour on a white bus with the civic dignitaries. And the people who you see in the picture here, the young woman at the front is an actor, but all the others are members of Salford Council, including the mayor, because Lindsay Anderson told them that he was making a documentary about the white bus tour that Salford Council had in reality set up as a riposte to Shelagh Delaney. And they had this bus that took people around showing them the sights. There was not a single theatre on the 31 sites that the white bus in Salford visited, but there were 3 car parks, which kind of said quite a lot about, but it was a real kind of Labour council that was like, what people need is housing and work. They don't need culture. So they all took part in this film, not realising that what was going to happen, which is, it's an incredibly way out film and very sort of surreal. But really what it's doing is getting a rise out of Salford Council, and Sheila had a lot of good fun making it. She then went on to be involved in other screenplays, including in the late 60s, Charlie Bubbles, which starred Albert Finney and is the only film that he directed, Working Class Lad from Salford. And it's a really interesting film because it explores the kind of contradictions and difficulties about being upwardly mobile as a young working class person, particularly in the arts, and the way in which the fame and the glamour and so on is really attractive, but also comes at the cost of leaving your home and your community. And it explores really whether you can resolve that. The way it's resolved in the film is that Charlie, the working class writer from Salford, sets off in a hot air balloon to God knows where, leaving behind his estranged wife and his child. But Sheila was aware by the late 1960s that the world was very different for women, that it was very different for her. And that was something that she began to explore more in the 1970s when she wrote a series of plays about women's lives that are very, have just been kind of lost now, but were televised. She had contracts with the BBC and with ITV, and they were very much about ordinary women of different ages exploring the ways that they could be autonomous in different ways in the 70s as things were changing. That was something that really interested me because I think, feminism achieved a huge amount in the 1970s, but we still don't know very much about it other than the kind of women's liberation movement that was sort of London-centred that I'm showing on this slide here. And one of the things about looking into Sheila's life and work was that it really shows just how deep and how widespread feminism was and how much it came out of the aspirations of Sheila's generation, working class as well as more middle class women. The 1970s also saw a revival of A Taste of Honey, and A Taste of Honey began to appear on the school curriculum of the new comprehensive schools, largely due to the results of feminist teachers, very often the first in their families to have had higher education. And I spoke to some of them about their fights to get it put on the curriculum, and to have those voices and those lives made part of children's education. It's never been off the school curriculum since. This phase of Sheila's career culminated in 1984 when she was asked to write the screenplay for Dance with a Stranger, the story of Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain. Sheila said it was the hardest and most worthwhile thing that she ever wrote because it took her back into writing about a woman who was coming of age in the 40s and 50s, and whose unrequited passion for Rupert Everett, the upperclassman in the picture here, who she eventually murdered, really set the centre of her life, and became very absorbing, really, for Ruth Ellis. And Sheila explored in the film how Ruth's passion was really condemned in the 1950s at a time when working class women just weren't meant to have those kinds of strong feelings, weren't meant to want that kind of sexual and emotional fulfillment that she was craving. And also was almost made stronger by the lack of Ruth's choices. Ruth Ellis was a single parent in the 50s, and her only way out of poverty was really prostitution or marriage. And she took the latter route, but couldn't really bring it in herself to give up on Everett. And so went after him. And as I said, a love affair that went very badly wrong, and she was treated very badly by the courts. And Sheila explored that with great sympathy and said revealingly that it was the most autobiographical thing that she'd ever written. That spoke to the turbulence of Sheila's private life as well. She had a series of long-running affairs and very loving affairs, but often with married men. And the people who she looked to for most consistent support really were a very tight group of women friends. She got a lot out of all of those relationships, but there was a lot of upset and sadness in her life in the 60s, 70s and 80s as well, as she saw, as so many women of her generation sought to explore what it really meant to be autonomous and independent as a woman, and to try to live a different kind of life. And those kinds of struggles, I think, still have a huge history to tell. So what happened in the rest of her life? She went on writing, and she had a renaissance in the late 1990s and 2000s when a feminist radio producer commissioned her to write a series of plays about older women in particular for Radio 4 that went down very well. But as I've just intimated, it was a tough life as well. The Thatcher's cuts to the arts meant that she lost a lot of commissions, and she ended up moving out of London to Filey, where she was quite lonely quite a lot of the time. And she struggled, as a lot of women struggled and struggle, with living alone and leading a life that she had no precedent for as she went into older age. But nevertheless, she was very proud of what she did and very uncompromising about it. And she said to her daughter when she was dying in 2011, "A Taste of Honey was my masterpiece, and I'm still really proud of it." And it is, of course, still being staged. And I just wanted to end with the end of the book, where I sort of reflect on Sheila's life and what it meant. Shelagh Delaney demanded that the audience become the actors and take centre stage. A Taste of Honey showed that it is possible to grow up in a conservative society and question its justifications, challenge convention, and change the world. She found acceptance in a new milieu of artists and writers who, regardless of background, shared Delaney's belief that anyone can create art, given the means to do so. She benefited from the chances that a welfare state and education gave to her generation, and used these to demand more for everyone. Times changed, and from the 1980s, it was harder to find directors and funders willing to back her ideas. Yet she continued to write, and in doing so, to show that those often considered marginal to political debate and artistic endeavour, working class people, and especially women and children, are the majority of the human race and deserve listening to. "I write as people speak," said Sheila. "How dangerous, how inspiring." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That was absolutely excellent. Right, we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. You will find, most of you will probably know, but you will find if you click on participants at the bottom of the screen, you will find the option to raise your hand. If you wish to ask a question, please click that, and I will indicate people as we would in a normal meeting. I have already received one question from Steve Ezrani, whose name I might have mispronounced, but he emailed it to me earlier, and I'd like to ask, is class understood differently by men and women? If class is understood differently, how is it manifested? Assuming that there is a difference in the understanding of class between men and women, is there any common ground at all? So perhaps you might like to start with, you know, start with the easy ones and we'll move on.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Steve.
Thank you. It's all right.
I think there's quite a lot of books in that, isn't there? I think, yeah, I think it is to some extent understood by men and women. I've always been really influenced by E.P. Thompson's understanding of class. And I have to say, in looking at Shelagh Delaney's life, that was really important because as a historian, I took quite a lot from the fact that he was living through the same times as her, and was actually very interested, particularly in the 50s and 60s, in writing about some of the cultural debates and the context in which she was working and that she was also very interested in. I think that there are real areas of overlap that have been brought to light by Labour historians, because we know now that women were industrial workers and so on, and so that's been really important. And in those ways, very often women's struggles were very similar to men's, and indeed very often we find men and women standing shoulder to shoulder on picket lines. But there are differences, and one of the big differences is the biological one. You know, put bluntly, women have the potential, or perceive to have the potential, to become mothers. And we know that in capitalist society, that has really affected the way that they're treated, the way that they are treated as potential workers, but also as reproducers of labour power. So their position in a class society is different from men's. That doesn't mean that we can't find common cause. But we need to think about what that means and think about how do we focus on women in different ways. Now, one of the ways that I've been really interested in is what that does to our idea about who the archetypal working class were. And one of the things that I've banged on about a lot, particularly in my previous book, The People, is the fact that the largest single group of working people in this country until 1939 were not miners or steelworkers, they were domestic servants. Yeah. So we need to start thinking about class from the point of view of women if we're going to really understand social relations. And one of the things that I argued in that book, and which I think comes through when we think about 50s society, is that the culture of service really permeated politics and social relations. The idea that some people were put on this earth to be served and others to serve is still there in the 50s. And it's something that really made an impact on women, but also on men. I think that they also experience it differently because women, and I'm talking particularly about Sheila's generation here, were brought up to believe that their primary role was going to be in the home and the neighbourhood. And what I think that means is I think that most young children, I know from my research, most young children spend a huge amount of time with their parents, particularly their mums, observing their mothers' lives. But for girls of Sheila's generation, that went on. And so the home and the neighbourhood, the kinds of things which are often talked about in class history as a kind of distraction from the main battleground, which is the workplace, were absolutely central to women's lives and central to class encounters as well. You know, you only have to read The Road to Wigan Pier to see, you know, that it's the landlords and it's the women meeting the landlords on the doorsteps. It's the poor law inspectors going into people's homes. It's the means test that really, you know, was where that fight was at very often. It's where the National Union of the National Unemployed Workers Movement comes out of. So there are differences there, but there are also real points to unite around. The abhorrence around the means test, which I would argue was experienced very acutely by women, was one of the reasons why we fought for the welfare state of 1945. The Grunwick dispute of 1976 is one where male trade unionists stood shoulder to shoulder with women who, were doing very different kinds of work from them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Any
you.
other questions? Next, please raise your hand should you wish to say anything. Well, while we're waiting for someone else, can I ask, while I was, I must confess to my shame, I'd never heard of Shelagh Delaney. So when I was told I had to chair this, I looked her up on Wikipedia. And one of the things I noticed at the bottom is this statement that the Smiths lead singer Morrissey said, "I've never made any secret of the fact that at least 50% of my reasoning for writing can be blamed on Shelagh Delaney. Whereas for most of us, Morrissey is virtually a fascist, you know? I mean, we might argue about whether he is or not, but he's not from our tradition, can I say, to say the least. So how does that fit in?
Yes, I'm really glad that you mentioned the Morrissey connection. So Morrissey, of course, has undergone change for the worse. I think we can probably all agree. So he was a very different character in the early 80s when he started his band. And Morrissey started getting interested in Sheila Delaney because he saw the film of Taste of Honey as a teenager at a secondary modern school in Stretford in Greater Manchester in the 70s. And one of the things that he was very attracted to was this idea that she tried to give life and voice to people who were in the kind of community that he was growing up in. But also, and I think this goes back to the point that was made earlier about, do women and men have, different views of class and so on. Morrissey was one of those secondary moderns, he's being told, the best you can aspire to be is a clerk. His mum really wanted him to be a clerk. Actually, by the time he left school, it was mass unemployment. Thatcher was in. But, he just didn't want any of that kind of life. He wanted something different. And like Sheila, he sort of struggled a bit to say exactly what that was. But he was interested in music. He was interested in the arts. And he felt like there was no scope that he was being given by school, by politicians, by the media, to talk about that, to explore that as a potential future. That's a side issue. And I think, one of the things that I really respected about Jeremy Corbyn, still do, is that he put culture absolutely at the centre of everything that he said. It wasn't, oh, this is some kind of side thing, once we've got, houses for them, and that's what Morrissey found inspiring about Sheila Delaney, was he researched her a bit and he found out a bit about her life and this kind of sense that she had that, women and children really matter. And that, the voices of people who are neither the elite nor on a picket line really matter. And that we need to think about their aspirations and their expectations. And so that's where he came from. And that's what got him into writing music, which then sort of took off in the 80s. But you're right, Steve, I think, we see it on the left now, without those political structures of the labour movement, without the trade union involvement, without involvement in a movement or a party, those kinds of messages about aspiration and doing your own thing can go all kinds of different ways, can't they? They can become very individualistic. Sheila herself was a massive contradiction. She was a lifelong Labour voter who hated Tony Blair, so totally right wing, but she sent her daughter to a private school because she wanted her to learn grammar. I guess part of what I was trying to do in the book was explore, how do people live with those contradictions and how do we understand them? How do people who are not in a movement work out those kinds of things?
Thank you very much. Right, I've got several speakers now. I'm going to ask the first two to speak, and if Sheila, you could then reply to two at a time, that would help us through the proceedings. Can I ask Philip Wiseman, please? You'll have to, when you speak, you'll have to unmute yourself. But if once you have spoken, you could remute, that would save the thing. So, Philip.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. And thanks very much for what you're doing, Selina. Thanks very much. I'm only going to relate my experience. I'm going on for 83 next April. And I worked in a company in Liverpool after going to HSC and going in the army. And at that time, I had 23 rates of pay, 23 different rates of pay. And some of us got together and said, we didn't like it, we'll have to change all this. And we got together. At that time, I was in the CP. I'm not now. Right? And we got together. And it took us a long time to change that situation. Well, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher was there available all that time. And we had a shop stewards committee of 14 shop stewards, and we never took a blind bit of notice of Margaret Thatcher. Whatever she fetched out, He just didn't bother. But that was based on, in the main, going from the bottom up, right? Even officials, some of the officials, I was in the old AEU, and some of the officials weren't too happy with us. But nevertheless, we resolved that situation. But is it, another part of it is this, those women you're talking, or some of the type of women you've been describing, they used to leave work and have a weekend, right? Because I lived by an industrial estate called Speak in Liverpool.
Oh yeah, I know Speak.
Right? And they'd go to the social clubs, right? Catholic clubs, Protestant clubs, whatever it was, Dunlops, whatever it was. What we didn't know, the women in them clubs, when they were in the clubs, were telling their other women, their friends, what kind of money we were getting for them in our factory. Now, we didn't know that, right? And it spread like wildfire. So in the end, we became the best paid. We had the best pensions in that particular area. Now, what I'm trying to point out is it was the women who spread the word. They didn't know they were spreading the word. They were just talking socially, and we didn't know it. And we also had other situations, believe it or not, where men who were made redundant, right, at that time, some of them, they wouldn't even tell their wives. They used to get up in the morning at 7 o'clock and go out. I don't know where they went to, but they went out and come back in the evening and pretend they'd been to work. And they wouldn't tell their wives. That came out later on. I can go on for a long time, Selina, but I won't anyway, because I don't want to ruin anybody else's. But thanks very much, Selina.
Thank you.
Thank you. And can Sheila Taylor has got a question and then or comment, and then we'll ask Selina to answer both of those. Sheila.
Yeah, thank you. Mine's a very quick question to Selina, actually, because I was born in 1942, so similar generation of feminists, actually, in the early 70s. And practical question, I've still got minutes book from my women's lib group that I kept in those days, and I've never handed it over because I've never known where to put it. And I've been desperately afraid of it getting lost. So as a feminist historian, where would be a safe place for me to put this book?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for both of those. Philip, that's such an inspiring story, and yeah, I've heard many more like that. And I think the other thing that you point us to there is that women's solidarity. You know, I just get really tired of histories of the women's liberation movement that say, oh, it was just a bunch of white middle class women in London, you know, just doing it for them. No, it's just that historians haven't done the hard work of going and documenting, you know, groups. I mean, Liverpool was such a centre of women's struggle in the 1970s for equal rights, equal pay, better housing rights, women's liberation. You know, that this was a struggle of working class women outside of London as well. And also I think what it points us to, and it's like your story about the way that grapevines work, is that if we're going to understand movements, we have to understand parties and trade unions and associations, but we also have to understand the kind of wider milieu. And one of the things that I think is really terrific achievement of Shelagh Delaney, but also of those teachers who I mentioned in the 70s who got her work on the school curriculum and did loads of work to bring about anti-sexist curricula at the same time, is that they were part of a movement as well. And one of the things I'm really excited about as a historian is working out, you know, how we bring those kinds of stories in to our understanding of liberation movements past and present. Sheila, oh my God, that's so great. So there are a couple of places that I would try, depending on where your group was. Feminist Archive North, which is based now at the University of Leeds, is a superb archive, and I think they'd be really interested. And then the other place that I would try is the National Women's Library, which is at the London School of Economics, and they should be interested as well. But yeah, please do contact them, because there are so few sources like that. Honestly, it's incredible.
Excellent, thank you. Right, next two speakers will be Duncan Bowie and David Morgan. So Duncan first, please.
Thanks very much, Selina. That was a fascinating talk. I mean, I was aware of Sheila Delaney, but not in the level of detail that you've obviously discovered. You commented in response to a question earlier, really, that she was always a Labour supporter, but didn't think much of Tony Blair. I think probably most of us are in a similar situation. But I'm just interested in to what extent, if at all, she was actually involved in any party politics, either Labour Party or Communist Party or anything else, or in local politics in Manchester and Salford, or had she so upset the Salford councillors by her spoof documentary that nobody was prepared to talk to her?
Right. David, if you've got a question or comment, please, and then we'll ask Selina to reply. David, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Am I being heard?
Yes, you are now.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Obviously, I'm from Salford, so I know a bit more about Sheila Delaney than maybe some of the others, and also Morrissey. I'm about 5 miles away now from where Morrissey used to go to the Salford Lads Club. So I remember in the very early 80s, I mean, I was a teenager, and Morrissey was very important as a musician because he was exploring questions of identity and masculinity, and he was popular with women and men and women as a musician. And I think he's changed obviously a lot now, and he's repeating himself a lot. But I think I can see why he was influenced by Sheila Delaney, because she was quite a radical, and you know, as Selina said, she was talking about single mothers, black people, gay people, at a time when that wasn't a popular thing to do, you know, in the late 50s, early 60s, as has been explained. But my question is that the play, Taste of Honey, it was revived about maybe 8 years ago, seven or 8 years ago, at the National Theatre, and I think it was revived the second time just before the lockdown. I was very disappointed to go and see this revival because they turned it into a bit of a pantomime with musical interludes, dance interludes, and they also did the same thing with Arnold Wesker's play The Kitchen about a year, maybe I think that was a year before, or maybe the same time, a year before that. And they put musical interludes in that. Now that's totally to misunderstand the purpose and the nature of the play, which is a quite kind of social realism, as explored by people like Lindsay Anderson in their films, and Richardson. I think Tony Richardson did the film of Taste of Honey, but they were in the tradition of the free cinema, which Lindsay Anderson launched. And I think Lindsay Anderson is very much neglected now. He wasn't a working class filmmaker, but he was a very radical filmmaker. He always called himself an anarchist in the cultural sense. I mean, I think in the political sense, he was maybe on the left, but not political, not aligned to any party. And I would like to just ask Selina what she thought of the revival and why she thinks people don't really understand, directors and producers and actors don't really understand these kind of plays now. And that suggests to me that they're remote from the audience. The producers and directors are remote from the working class audience. I mean, it's the lifestyle of those people is still there, but it's not being effectively portrayed on stage and screen anymore.
Thanks very much indeed, David. Cheers. Thanks for both of those questions. Yeah, in answer to Duncan, no, she wasn't, because she got involved, but you know, like a lot of people, my mum, who I can see is on this, although she's been very quiet, she said to me recently, you know, just get involved in stuff politically when it energizes you. Well, that was Sheila all over. You know, she'd seen her mum and dad have a tough life, and she got involved where she felt that the zeitgeist was, and there was something going. And I'm a bit the same way myself. You know, I think with feminism at the moment, I kind of see that. You know, there's an excitement. I went to a feminist conference about 6 months ago, and there were 1,000 women there. You know, all colours, all classes, packed into this thing in London. And you know, we've all been there. That moment where you think, you know, the chill goes down your spine. You think there's something really happening here. And so Sheila was very attracted to things like that. So, you know, as we just heard, you know, she explored issues of racism and single parenthood in the late 50s. And where she saw that coming through in politics in the early 60s, she was there. So she got involved in anti-apartheid, she was involved in CND, but she found, and Vanessa Redgrave tried to get her involved in left-wing groups, but she just found it really boring. She couldn't stand going to meetings. I mean, who can, really? So she found that that didn't really speak to her. Although she had a lot of respect for people who did. And I mentioned that she worked, when she was very interested in setting up a community theatre in Salford, that idea actually came from her on the one hand, but also from Salford Trades Council on the other. And it was they who made contact with her. And in fact, they did her a big favour that she never forgot, which was that when the Salford local newspaper in the early 60s, when the film of A Taste of Honey came out, the Salford local newspaper went for her again and started attacking her. And Salford Trades Council sent a delegation and occupied the newspaper offices until the editor agreed to print an apology to Shelagh Delaney and say there are people in Salford who do think this is a great play. So they were very good to her. So she had a lot of time for people who were involved in those kinds of things. But she saw her contribution as being through her writing, through the kind of creative work that she did. And she remained very involved in Theatre Workshop, for example, as a place where she saw that kind of thing happening. Even though she had differences of opinion with Joan, she did remain involved with that. And I think, yeah, it's a real reminder to us of how important those kinds of cultural groups and so on can be as points of inspiration, as points of bringing people in and enabling people to make history in different sorts of ways. David, yeah, on the point about the revival, I was probably more positive than you. Sheila's play, unlike Wesker's, was never social realist. She wasn't a social realist, and it always had musical interludes, and that was something that she very much wanted. And that goes back to something that I touched on possibly too briefly in the talk, really, which is she really wanted to explore the imaginative side of life. And she thought that dancing and music were places where young women in particular were able to explore different ways of being and explore different identities at a time when society didn't really allow them many outlets for self-expression. So for her, that was always very important, not just for A Taste of Honey, but for her subsequent work, including her late radio plays. And I think that, again, you know, that's really interesting because to my mind, she was grappling, using music, using dance, using folk song in some ways as well, to try to explore, form, articulate ideas which really only reached the political agenda in a clear-cut, crisper form in the 1970s. And there's a really interesting untold history of the 50s there, I think, and the way that surrealism played a role in people being able to do that. But I agree with you, and I think that there is a big loss in that recent revival, and I think it's the lack of politics. I think you're right. I think it's partly the social distance, and related to that, the lack of politics. I'm very sympathetic to the kind of critique of theatre at the moment that it is, you know, it's too dominated by people who are privately educated and Oxbridge educated. But having said that, you know, some of the people in our movement have been, you know, Tony Benn, E.P. Thompson, you know, they came from elite backgrounds, but they wanted to close that distance. And I don't see that there with a lot of modern theatre. They're lacking the socialist and the feminist politics. And it's partly because groups like Theatre Workshop just are not there. You know, we've just not got those kinds of cultural critiques. And a place where I see that really strongly is if you look at the study guides that are produced by exam boards and so on for children studying A Taste of Honey, they really change. So in the 1980s, 1990s, Helen, the single mother in Taste of Honey, is presented really sympathetically in many of those study guides. And by the 2000s and the 2010s, many of the study guides encourage children to demonize Helen as this person who is very selfish because she's always thinking about herself, not her daughter. And that's why I feel really strong, you know, it's so important that we introduce children to feminism and to socialism, and to the fact that those are both traditions that have always encouraged very lively debate and freedom of speech.
Thank you. Right, there's two more people asked to speak, but I've also there's a question on the chat from and I might get this wrong because my eyesight's not quite what it could be. Riyad Akbar says, can you say more about the community theatre of the 1930s and 40s in Manchester and whether this has a bearing on Sheila's development? I'd also add that we've had a very nice message from Wellington in New Zealand from someone saying that they're enjoying it even though they've had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to participate. So that's Rosemary Lowe. So welcome, Rosemary, and thank you for your effort. But if you'd like to answer that one from the about the 30s and 40s from the chat, and then we'll take the last two hands up.
Yeah, delighted to. So Theatre Workshop came out of the Communist Party and also unaligned socialists in the 1930s. Joan Littlewood herself was from quite a wealthy background. She'd been at Cambridge University, but she teamed up with Ewan McCall, who many of you will be very familiar with. And they started, you know, they were part of the great agitprop tradition of the 1930s, you know, a real kind of sense of, you know, of bringing hope and creativity into working class and socialist organisations and communities before the Second World War. And it continued during the Second World War and after. Theatre Workshop then got a permanent base in the Manchester Library Theatre after the Second World War, although Joan later decided to take it to London. One of the really exciting, and I think to some extent still untold stories about the welfare state is that, you know, it's incredible, isn't it? At a time of great austerity and huge uncertainty about the future, that Labour government, and, you know, I've critiqued them for some things today, but they thought that putting money into the arts was a really good idea. And they did it. And you know, establishing the Arts Council and so on was just absolutely brilliant. And at a time when local government had more power, more autonomy than it does today, many local authorities, particularly Labour ones, and Manchester and Salford were among those, decided that they would invest in the arts as well. So there was a huge investment in Manchester and Salford in theatre and theatre competitions and so on in the 40s and 50s. Albert Finney talks quite a lot about this because some of the grammar schools were very, very involved in the kind of theatrical culture that began to develop. And one of the things that Finney always said he thought was important was that some of the teachers who were teaching in those schools had only recently been demobbed, had very often lost the chance of higher education as a result of the war, had gone through the emergency teacher training scheme at the end of the war, and were just desperate for a bit of culture themselves and thought, well, we'll create it. And so there was this incredibly vibrant culture. And it's interesting, I think, that Sheila is someone who grew up in a family that I don't think we'd call it, you know, a particularly political family. You know, our parents were not, you know, directly involved in the Labour Party, for example. But nevertheless, she had this real sense growing up, a very unself-conscious sense that socialism and the arts were very much connected. So this whole thing about, you know, telling stories about her granddad having met Keir Hardie and so on went alongside, you know, this idea of her dad being an incredibly great storyteller and she herself, you know, being drawn to the theatre because of all of that. So really, I mean, really interesting. You know, I often go back at the moment to Stephen Yeo's very seminal article from the late 1970s now about the new life of socialism in the late 19th century and the importance of culture at that moment in socialism. And I think it's a really hopeful part of the tradition that I don't think has ever been lost, but I think I as a scholar could sometimes do more to promote.
Thank you. Right, we've got, and I think Selina's done us proud already. We've got 2 more questions, and then we'll thank her and finish. So I have, first of all, Jeff Brown, and then Francis King. So you'll have to unmute yourselves.
Yeah. Thank you very much so far, Selina. It's been wonderful. Can I just come back to the white bus? I mean, I'm a big fan of it. But it does seem to be a missed opportunity, something incomplete, something that had potential that wasn't fulfilled. You know, it's made 1967. It focuses on Salford. It ruthlessly satirizes the local political elite. you know, the mayor, beautifully played by Arthur Lowe, with his fat chain around his neck, going around, complete Wally. It seems to me that the hopes that were raised by sort of Jenny Lee being the Minister of Arts in the government at the time were completely thrown away by councils like Salford. Salford is the council where the chair of the planning committee, Albert Jones, goes to jail for trying to pick up a bribe. He's also, more importantly, really, the man who is the chair of the planning committee that leads to the appalling Ellis Street estate, these monster tower blocks. And there's a bit of film somewhere of Sheila in the Kersal Flats walking around talking about the alienation of these new tower blocks and so forth. And it just seems to me that the White Bus really brings all this together. And I mean, I think I saw it on YouTube once. I've just searched again and can't find it properly, but it just seems to me something that showed a really exciting aspect of her work, which, because it's not complete, doesn't get discussed properly.
Right, last question from Francis, please. Thank you very much, Jeff. Francis?
Can you hear me?
We can now, yes.
Oh, now it's appeared, yeah. Oh, now
Can't
it's
see.
appeared. Can't see me. I got my wires tangled up. Yeah, fascinating talk, and you spoke quite a lot about Sheila Delaney's educational background, and I couldn't help thinking maybe I've been too long in higher education and got a bit jaded. Do you actually think that the current education system and the way it works could possibly produce a Sheila Delaney now? It seems to me that she's very much of her time, and that time has possibly gone. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Selina.
Yeah, thanks for both of those. Yeah, Jeff, in terms of the White Bus, I'm glad to find a fellow fan. I think part of the issue with it, I absolutely agree with you. It's kind of incomprehensible parts of it, and it's very much unfinished. And I think that there is some practical reasons for it, and then some not so practical reasons. So practically, it was meant to be part of a trilogy that Anderson was going to do with other directors, and then the whole idea fell apart. So it made less sense because it became a standalone. And Sheila was a bit hacked off about that because she was going to write each of the parts for the three trilogies, for each of the parts within the trilogy. And then this ended up being a standalone. And when Sheila got disenchanted with something, she really couldn't make any effort to work. And Lindsay Anderson actually said after working with her that he loved her to bits, but she was lazy as hell. And I think she would have been quite proud of that, because she definitely didn't work any more than she needed to. And she was quite clear that although she loved writing, she also really liked the fact that she was able to spend a lot of time with her daughter and able to lead the high life in London, really. And I think White Bus sort of suffered from that to some degree. I think also, excuse me, Anderson aside, she had very few mentors in the 1960s. She wanted to break away from Joan Littlewood and really become her own woman. But as I sort of tried to intimate, I spoke to a number of people who appear in the book who say, very often from working class backgrounds in the theatre world, and they talked very revealingly and very well about the fact that, you know, most people when they're in a career like that don't just have to win one prize or, you know, make one great play and then, you know, expect that everything's going to be okay. Actually, what they rely on are long-standing networks and mentors to help them along the way. And that as a working class woman, Sheila really didn't have any of that, particularly when she left Theatre Workshop. She'd had this great first play, but everybody was sort of quite keen to go, oh, well, it's just a flash in the pan. So her interest in surrealism and so on, which is also there in Line in Love, was never really properly mentored or developed. And I think that was a bit of a problem. The wider issue as well, which is something that I get into more in the book, is that I think women writers on the whole in the 60s found it very difficult to write endings. And that because they were of a generation who were trying to lead very different lives from those their mothers had led, but were also conscious that their lives were going to be very different from their male counterparts. What you see with a lot of Sheila's work in the 60s, but also you see it explored by writers like Margaret Drabble, in works like The Millstone, it's very difficult to know, where does the story end and how do I end it? You know, there's no resolution really, because they're trying to do something so different. And, you know, very often motherhood becomes the resolution and the end point, but it's also a start point. So you have this sense of women's lives in flux, which I think to some extent comes through in The White Bus. I agree with you, it's really worth a watch. Part of the problem with it, with the whole trilogy not coming out, was that they lost distribution rights. So there were very few copies out there. So aside from clips on YouTube, it's really difficult to get hold of, although Sheila's daughter Charlotte tells me that there are moves afoot in America, or there were pre-COVID, to try to get a distribution for it. So fingers crossed. And Francis, in terms of the current education system, you know, could it produce her? You know, I have to say, you know, I have really good friends who are teachers in comprehensive schools, and they're still doing absolutely great stuff with kids, and, you know, really still trying to, you know, inspire them and do fantastic stuff with them. And, you know, lots that we have now, that we establish now, just wasn't there in Sheila's time. I mean, you know, the idea that was reinforced this week, actually, that feminist teachers in the 1970s and 1980s actually made it unacceptable to teach gender stereotypes as normative in schools. I mean, what a breakthrough. Sheila didn't have any of that. So I think that there have been huge things that have changed. But I have to say, as a university teacher, I really try not to be too invested in what we as teachers can ever achieve. And I don't think Sheila was produced by the education system. You know, it's very telling that she played truant from school a lot. She never really enforced her own daughter going to school. You know, she was produced by, you know, a whole milieu of circumstances. And to some extent, she was writing against the schooling that she had, particularly the schooling at the grammar school. Having said that, I would want to end on a positive note. And, you know, one of the things that really came through from my research on this, and is therefore is it influencing the book that's coming out next year about social mobility, is the value of adult education. And I guess that goes back to Jenny Lee. And one of the things that Jenny Lee did achieve, of course, was the Open University. And Sheila's work was really picked up on and revived by adult education groups and the Open University, you know, right through the 70s, you know, till now. And Sheila was really pleased by that. You know, she often got letters from students who'd come across it later in life. And I was so pleased because I felt like that was sort of mirrored for me, because a few months ago, I got a letter from a woman who'd read it and who told me that she'd left school at 16 because that was the respectable thing to do, and, you know, go and get a little job until you get married. And then in her 40s, she'd managed to get a degree through adult education. And she said, I don't know why, but reading your book, I felt like I had something in common with Shelagh Delaney. And I thought, well, you did, because you didn't let them say, that's enough for you. You said, no, I'll have more, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the whole audience for being the most disciplined Zoom audience I've ever had to deal with, which we have had some trouble elsewhere, but thank you very much. You've all behaved absolutely impeccably. Selina, that was a really interesting talk. For someone like me who didn't know anything about the theatre even, let alone the things you were talking about, it's made me want to read the book.
Thank you.
So I think that's very very useful and very important. So before we thank Selina, there will be more of these. We will, the Socialist History Society will arrange for more such meetings. We have, I have all of your email addresses because you've registered. I'll make sure that you at least get the option not to come by knowing about them, and so on. So before we go, let's all thank Selina, at least visually, for a marvellous talk.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Can I just add that we've had 53 people participating, which I think is a record and actually beats the late Eric Hobsbawm. So thank you very much, Selina. It's obviously a very popular speaker. So I hope you come back and speak on social mobility after your next book. Can I also just remind those of you that aren't members to join Socialist History Society, and to all of you, whether you're members or not, do tell us what you're researching, what you're writing about, what you've published, so we can actually publish it either in the newsletter or on our website, or both, and the contact details are on our website. So thanks very much.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sheila, that was brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.